This is episode 176. I'm Tommy Serafinsky, and this is Conservation and Science Podcast, where we take a deep dive into topics of ecology and conservation. And those of you who are with me for some time, that I like reading scientific papers. It's even in my profile that I read scientific papers. And usually I don't feel like I need to comment or bring that to your attention. But every now and then, there is a paper so cool that I just cannot move on without bringing it to your attention. And today, we are going to talk about the research that was summarized in one of those papers. The title is Disruption of an Ant-Plant Mutualism Shapes Interaction Between Lions and Their Primary Prey. So, long story short, a species of invasive ants is impacting hunting patterns of lions. This is just one of those chain reactions in the ecosystem that are happening and we often not aware of. So to discuss this paper, our guest today is Adam T. Ford, an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Wildlife Restoration Ecology at the University of British Columbia, Kelowna, Canada. The lead on this paper, though, is the PhD student Douglas Kamaru, who's a student at the University of Wyoming in Goheen lab. That's Professor Jake Goheen. And there are two other leads on the paper, Todd M. Palmer from the University of Florida and Corinna Riginos, also from University of Wyoming. But overall, there was something like 20 contributors to the paper. Incredibly interesting stuff. And during the conversation with Adam, we not only discussed the research described in this paper, but we also talk a little bit about invasive species and, what to do about invasive species, how to deal with invasive species, because ultimately that whole deal is about an invasive species of ants. And I feel like we are in the without any further delay moment of this introduction, so enjoy the show. Adam, welcome to the show. Such a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
Is it always this thing like when you follow people on Twitter for some time and then they turn out to be like the real people that you'd speak to?
I'm actually an AI bot.
Oh no, you ruined it for me. Listen, we're here to talk about the paper that made some waves in the media, and we're going to jump into that in a second. I would just like you to maybe introduce yourself for listeners and also mention a team. I counted like 20 contributors to the paper. So, whichever introductions are required, please.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Adam Ford. I'm an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Wildlife Restoration Ecology at the University of British Columbia in Kelowna, Canada. And yeah, I have a lab of graduate students, undergraduate students. We work on large mammal ecology. We think of restoration as, bringing back animal movement, migrations, interactions between people and wildlife, coexistence between carnivores and people, and trying to understand how landscape change is affecting wildlife populations, kind of drives or motivates our work. And this paper was pretty cool to be a part of. It was been in the works for many years, and to finally see it come out last month was a thrill. So the paper was led by Douglas Kamaru, and he's a PhD student at the University of Wyoming in the Goheen lab. So that's Jake Goheen, and other leads on the paper were Todd Palmer and Corinna Riginos.
And overall, 20 contributors. That was
and lots of help from a lot of different folks within that, for sure.
Yeah. Let's just jump into the paper itself. For folks who don't know what we're talking about, I'm going to read the title again. Disruption of Ant-Plant Mutualism Shapes Interaction Between Lions and their Primary Prey. So maybe just top contour. What is the research about, and what are we talking about? And then we're going to dive deeper into details of it.
Yeah, it's a really cool ecological story. It is a bit tragic in that it involves an invasive species. So one of the, drivers of biodiversity decline is invasive species. This study kind of speaks to the effect of an invasive ant and how it shaped the food web involving, lions and zebra and even how elephants are consuming trees. So there's a lot of cool ecological links. It's kind of like ecology bingo. There's all sorts of interactions. If you flip through an ecology textbook, you can go check, 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 check. They're all in there. So yeah, it's pretty neat to follow the pathway, how one relationship is changed and how that trickles through the whole food chain and how that reverberates across whole landscapes.
So yeah, it's like you change one little cog. It speaks to the fact that the ecosystems are so complex and there's like so many moving parts and connections between each other that you never should expect that you can remove or even change one aspect of it and don't see the aspects in the somewhere else. So let's go step by step. We have species of ants that is protecting trees from, I love the phrase, lethal herbivory. I just love this, lethal herbivory by elephants, right? How they're doing, like, are they, like on a in the layman terms, are they gonna just sting the elephant in the trunk, or like how they?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of different, we'll call them acacia trees. I think that's probably a more familiar image in people's minds. And this one particular tree is called the whistling-thorn acacia, and in its thorns, they get swollen and it creates a little home for ants, for a particular species of ant.
In that bulb of the thorn, because the thorn has like a bulb at the base.
Right. And then they drill a little hole in it, and when the wind passes over that hollow structure, it makes a whistling sound. So that's why they call it the whistling thorn. But that little home for the ants, called Demacia in science, provides shelter for the ant. And then the tree also produces some nectar. So a place to live for the ant and some food. And the trade-off for the ant is, I'm going to protect my home and my grocery store. And so whenever an elephant or giraffe or even a human bumps into that tree, the ants come swarming out, and they'll get into the nostrils and in the eyes and the ears of the disturber. And that's annoying even if you're an elephant. So the elephants would rather eat somewhere else, or at least not spend a lot of time in that particular tree before they go on to the next one.
Yeah, that was my thought, because anyone who saw, for example, I saw a video of a bear ripping out a beehive, and the bear got stung and didn't like it, but was keep eating it. So it's like, how on earth, ants would deter elephant? But like you said, the elephant will learn and then probably not just spend too much time on it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's one way that they protect crops in this part of the world, is with bee fences, and it's enough to keep the elephants out. So yeah, elephants are pretty smart.
Yeah, you're right. I heard about that. Okay, fine. So we have those ants who live on those acacia trees, and that's what's called mutualism, is it?
Right, mutualism, where it's like a plus relationship. You get something from me, and I get something from you.
So tell us what is happening. So what is happening next?
Right. So just to take one step back, this particular acacia, this whistling-thorn acacia, only really lives in one type of soil. So there's like sandy soils in this area, and you have a very diverse community of acacia trees in that sandy soil. There's another type of soil that's actually more common, that's got a lot of clay in it, and that's where this whistling-thorn acacia thrives. And it's like, I don't know, 80% of the trees in this area. So it's almost like a monoculture of these acacia, this whistling-thorn acacia. Okay, so along comes the observation. I guess we'll start with the scientific observation in the field that tree cover has been declining, fewer trees over recent years. And that got people wondering what's causing that decline in trees. Some ideas may be that, elephants are making a comeback. Maybe there's more elephants around, and they're just tipping over more trees. That's possible. But it's really, these whistling thorn trees are generally pretty robust to herbivory. Like, they kind of stick around. They're really tough, as I mentioned. So there must be something else going on. And that's when people started noticing that this invasive ant was on the scene. This is called a big-headed ant. It's invasive in different parts of the world. There's been problems of it flaring up in Australia. And the observation was that where these big-headed ants occur, the native protected ant, the mutualist ant, is no longer there.
But you say the acacia is fairly robust, but is it robust because of those ants living, or is it fairly robust on its own as well?
It looks pretty tough on its own, but if you take off the ants, it's very vulnerable. So our colleagues did an experiment about 14 years ago now, and they took ants from that mutualism and stuck them on a different type of acacia, so with different kinds of thorns. And they also took that whistling-thorn acacia, removed all the ants, and they fed them to elephants. And it was the presence of ants that protected the tree, regardless of any other combination of leaves and thorns. So we know the ants are really good at doing that job of protecting the tree. But the invasive ant doesn't do that. It's not set up for that mutualism. When the invasive ant shows up, it will rip the native mutualist ant from limb to limb to limb to limb to limb to limb. It's pretty tough.
So where those invasive ants came from? Were they like a human assisted?
I'm not sure where the original batch came from, but it's thought to maybe have come in on firewood or crops or something.
So then once they show up, they remove the mutualist ant, and that leaves the trees vulnerable.
Yeah. So we needed to confirm experimentally what the story was. And we started out by putting up exclosure fences to keep elephants out in areas on either side of the invasion front. So the invasive ant is spreading at about 50 meters a year. And so these plots are established on either side of that invasion front. So areas, you can think of like a 2A experiment. So you've got areas that exclude elephants in an invaded part of the landscape and areas that exclude elephants in an uninvaded part of the landscape. And where there was invasion and elephants were allowed, visibility went up quite a bit, from about 10 meters visibility to about 40. So the visibility is associated with tree cover. And that's where the story gets really interesting for other parts of the food web.
Visibility in terms like herbivores being visible in the area.
Right. So if you just were to stand in one of these invaded areas that allow elephants, you'd be able to see 4 times as far through the landscape. And so what does that mean? Well, for some of these predators in this landscape, they need cover to hide themselves so they can attack and kill their prey. And that's especially true for lions, which is the main predator in this area. So once you remove visibility, once you can create more visibility by removing trees, it gets harder for lions to do what they normally do, which is sneak up on zebra and kill them.
You already alluded, because one of my questions was like, how research like that even starts, right? It was said, I read about this, there's a lot of pop articles about it, and we'll get to that later on. I said 3 decades of research. So it's just I was like wondering like how this even starts, but you already said it was like it started with like, oh, why the trees are disappearing.
It's one of these systems where people have invested in doing science for a long time, and that's so valuable. I mean, a lot of research funding is oriented around short-term projects, like a 5-year PhD project might be a lot. I mean, that's a pretty big grant to share with your bosses at the university. Hey, I got 5 years of funding. Wow. But some of these observations play out over a much longer period of time, and we don't always know what's going to happen. We don't always know that there's going to be an invasion of ants. A lot of the data that was used in this study was collected long before people were talking about a big-headed ant invasion. It's that people were working together and investing in research in a particular area, and then changes happened, as they often do in nature. And if people hadn't invested in a collaborative approach to long-term research in a particular area, we would have missed this story. So I feel like this is a theme for science around the world, whether it's in Ireland or Canada or Kenya. We're pressured to finish things sooner than I think, than they deserve, really.
For sure. This is very good. This is very important point that you're making, because like you said, it's like with everything, with politics, the same thing. Like if everything is like in a 4-year cycle or a 5-year cycle, these things require time, especially in science, like you said, it requires. So at what point the connection with the behavior, with the hunting behavior of lions came in, and you might talk about this, like how that impacted the behavior of lions, because obviously it's harder for them to hunt in a way they hunt, but what was their, did they adapt it in any way, and like how that piece came together and was connected into like, oh, why we losing whistling acacia tree?
Right. So during this study, they had our colleagues in this project, some of the co-authors, had GPS collars fit to lions in this property. So this is at Old Pejeta Conservancy in Kenya. And I think we had 6 collared animals, each in a different pride. So that's about 66 lions. And you can tell when lions are either very inactive or if they've killed something based on the pattern in those GPS locations and how they show up on your computer. So then people would go out and investigate what we call a GPS cluster, a cluster of points from the GPS collar, and see what the lion was doing in that area. And that's where we discovered what they were feeding on and the type of habitat that they were feeding on in the study. So we noticed that, they definitely like to kill zebra. That's their preferred prey. So about 60% of the things lions kill in the system were zebra. And most zebra were killed by lions. That's how you die if you're a zebra, 90% of the time. So we got a sense of what lions were eating and then where. So whenever they made a kill site, we measured visibility in that area. And we discovered that, which is pretty common knowledge, that lions use cover to conceal themselves as they attack and kill prey.
Like most cats, right? They're ambush predators.
Absolutely. Yeah. So then we have this observation that lions like cover to kill things, but cover is declining. So what does that mean? And that's where this long-term data come in. And we've noticed that over time, the proportion of zebra in the lion's diet has been declining, and it's being made up by Cape buffalo, which is a huge animal to attack, right? These are big, scary beasts. And so lions have made a switch, and there's some reason for that. And we don't see a relationship between cover or visibility and buffalo kills. So whatever makes a buffalo vulnerable to being killed by a lion doesn't depend on woody cover in the same way that it does for a zebra.
That's interesting. Do you know why so? Is it like they don't require that much cover to attack the buffalo?
Yeah, I feel like having that cover doesn't help get you closer to a buffalo. There's probably other things that they're using to take advantage of a buffalo.
How does it overall impact a lion population? Is that switch no problem? Okay, we're gonna be. I would imagine that based on the number of injuries that lions sustain, hunting buffalo alone must have impact.
Right. I think, the theory would say that lions were probably doing something optimal for them prior to the invasion. So zebra, because it's abundant and probably less dangerous to a lion, is a safer and more reliable food source. And the consequences of changing to something more dangerous must have an impact on fitness for lions that must affect them somehow. But we're not seeing that in the population data yet. So you're right. There could be injuries. There could be other measures in the population dynamics like birth rates and other things that are just not showing up in the data we have. But so far, the lion population appears to be stable in spite of these changes, which I think is a really, important point about land management. So we have an invasive species that's changing tree cover. Like imagine what that would look like in the boreal forests of the Northern Hemisphere, that this like massive change in tree cover. Well, in this system, the food web has been retained since forever, right? Like there's still these large mammals roaming the landscape. It's being changed. The landscape's being changed a lot, but the food web generally is intact. We're missing some rhinos and some other things, but there's people raising cattle right alongside these large mammals as they have done for a very long time. And I think that this part of the story is testament to that land management practice where in a robust, like intact food web, species like lions have the opportunity to switch prey. And in a more simple or degraded food web, that might not be an option, and we would expect a decline to occur sooner.
That's excellent point. Or human-wildlife conflict increase if they switch to cattle.
Right. That's a great point. Yeah. Someone else mentioned that at the conference a couple of weeks ago. And I started asking my colleagues about it, and we don't have data on it, but the way that cattle are herded in this area makes them pretty safe to lion conflict already. So they're kept in caged bomas or corrals at night, and they're watched over during the day. So there may have been in a less well managed ranching system, there may have been more conflict. That's a fair hypothesis to look at.
It makes me think, the Europe struggling with wolves attacking cattle, and yet there you go in Kenya we have herding practices that protect them from lions.
Yeah, definitely a long history of people, cattle, livestock, and large carnivores, in eastern Kenya. That's the way it's been for a long time. And Europe was like that for a long time too. And, and now we're sort of seeing what it looks like when that memory was lost from those agricultural systems. And now it's, being forced to dust off some of the old textbooks about how we live alongside species like wolves.
Exactly. That's the point that is coming up over and over again, that we forgot about, how to live with those animals, or even by extension forgot the value of them, like a cultural value of the animals. Going back to that research, Adam, I am interested, like how all those pieces were connected into like one research. So was it, in a hindsight, was it like inevitable that you will connect the dots, or was it like, oh, like what happens with lions? Oh, what happened with acacia? And was it like an element of like a random luck, let's say, that it all came together? Because like you said, there's like so many steps from ants to elephants, acacia, lions, zebras, buffalo, all that.
Yeah, I think I don't want to say it's totally luck, but there's an element that this was not, like a lot of the data used in this study were not created with the intention of contributing to the study. And you already got to one of the next questions, like what about the conflict piece? So that type of question, we learned something. Now what's the next step? What's the next question? Do we have data for that? Oh, look, we do, because there's a bunch of people that have invested in research and monitoring in this area. So we have data to ask that next question. And we ask the next question. We have data for it. Then someone's like, well, what happens next after that? And we just kept pushing it until we ran out of time, money, and data. So it's pretty cool. I mean, that's why, again, I just love the idea of working in a collaborative way in shared spaces, because no one really goes out thinking about how an invasive ant is connected to a lion kill. Like that's not, our disciplines aren't really set up to think that way, to teach researchers how to do that. You have ant people, you have large mammal people, you have plant people. So it's about forming these teams and filling in the gaps in our knowledge and our data collection and our collaborative networks to make this stuff happen.
That's a good point. I was also talking some time ago about the collecting data on various subjects, like for example, shark tagging and so on. And the point that is a lot of time made is like, yeah, this data is there, and then different scientists are coming and they want to and there's like totally different things, and that's where like synergies like these are happening. Were you involved in the lions coloring?
I was not. No.
Do you know how this thing, whether they darted or like how they were doing it? Do you know?
They might do. It's probably in the paper, to be honest. I know they typically do leg hold, like a soft leg hold trap. Okay.
Like a snow leopards, like a snaring, basically.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Like snares had like a bad rap, and especially in like Scotland, UK, like a big thing with snares being banned, and the people go like, "Hey, how is it humane?" Like scientists are capturing animals using snares, but obviously, like you said, it's called soft leg hold.
Yeah, I think there's this.
Yeah. This aspect.
And then after that, there would be some sort of chemical immobilization to do all the sampling and fitting of the collar.
Gotcha. Listen, knowing what we know now, like hindsight is always 2020. How soon one can see the impacts of those ants? Because I understand it took 30 years to connect all the dots, but if someone had like a sixth sense, or maybe now knowing what we know from the paper, how soon you could see the impact on the lives, like a downstream impacts effectively once the ants starts to colonize? Because like you said, we know how quickly ants are colonizing. So is it a matter of years before we see the impact of it, or is it, what's the time frame?
We have some pretty sparse data on tree cover over time. I think our one figure in this paper, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have 5 or 6 years of tree cover. So that goes back to the 2000s. So not bad, like quite a long span. And the trend is pretty consistently declining, that they're losing about 650 hectares of woody cover per year. So what we don't know, we can see the effect on woody cover. We can't actually see the ant from space, right? So there is some measuring indirect, or looking at indirect measures of that invasion, but the idea is probably that woody cover decline is caused by this ant.
Wow. So as always, there's like way more research to do on this. And then go ahead.
Can I just add one more thing? The plots I was telling you about, the exclusion plots. So that's an electric wire that keeps the elephant. So that study took place over just 3 years, that piece. And we saw changes in woody cover. So 2.5%, 2.5 times more woody cover in those plots that allowed elephants and that were invaded. So it's almost, on an annual basis, you will start to see it.
Before we go into I just want to park that thought now for a second about the ecological part of our discussion, and talk about the media coverage. So the article was received like a tremendous media coverage. There was like a lot of popular science and like a mainstream media also covering that paper. I'm just wondering, like, what did that happen organically? Because it was published in the Journal of Science, very very coveted journal. So was that part of the media communication plan to notify all the media outlets, or did that happen organically?
A bit of both. So there's when Science, the magazine, the journal, publishes something, they release a press release on a service called Eureka Alert, and it's under embargo, which means a select group of reporters can view it, but they can't release the story until the embargo is lifted, which is when the paper is released. But they can talk to co-authors, they can collect extra images or video for web stories, etc. So between the paper being published, when that Eureka Alert went out over the wire, we were very busy communicating with media. And then when the paper was finally out, all that media was starting to be released. But then on top of that, some of us do retain sort of contacts in the mainstream media, and reached out on a personal basis to just connect with some reporters that we've worked with in the past.
Yeah, and I guess that's something that a lot of scientists, I feel I could take a page of your book and do that and kind of like talk about the communication as well. They can also contact their favorite podcaster to record the podcast about it. Listen, I'm just curious about like how when you obviously you're deep into the analysis and statistical models and everything, how it came to be, and then you like what's your reception of these popular papers? Because someone like Scientific American had a title like "Lions are changing their hunting strategy because of ant invasion." This is fair enough, right? Popular Science, invasive ants leave lions scrambling for prey on the savanna ecological chain. Like, oh, I'm not sure if they're scrambling for prey, right? And then you go to paper like a mainstream media like Independent, how an army of ants saved zebras from hungry lions. And I can only imagine that people who were like involved in that, reading that header, is like, oh my God. How does it look from your perspective when you're reading about army of ants saving zebras from hungry lions?
Yeah, I mean, it's in there. I mean, that's not too far from the truth, but of course, these people have a much more, colorful way of describing these things. And yeah, so far nothing's been taken too out of context or damaging on this one. I think the press releases out from our universities, but also science we're pretty good. And then the scientists, we sort of took turns taking different interviews, and people were able to control the message that way too. So thankfully on this one, but it can, some reporters can take things in a different direction than we really intend, and that can actually be a bit damaging. It's not just like an eye roll, but it's like, this is not helping the conversation. That doesn't happen too much, but it is something that we're wary of. And that's sometimes reporters will find a way of explaining things that we miss because we're a bunch of nerds looking at statistics and bar plots and things. And then we have reporters come along and go, look at this cool connection between, ants and zebras. Like that's another way of explaining things too. So I do learn a lot from how those stories are told, because, as a scientist, we are just a type of storyteller, right? So we use data to tell our stories, but then we have to go to conferences, we were on podcasts, and have to kind of reformat the language and delivery so that it's accessible to the audiences that we're speaking to. But everybody loves a good story, and I think working with media helps tell that story better. I learn a lot.
100%. With the caveat that it doesn't change the main thrust of the story. So I'm getting that you are quite happy with that. I think that this is mainly happening with medical stories. I remember I was reading somewhere such and such compounds increases testosterone in men 100 times. And then, you read the actual paper and you see that test study was men between 60 and 80 years old with the, heavy alcohol and nicotine abuse history. So sure, the compound boosts their testosterone, which was naturally low. Does have no bearing to 30-year-olds, and yet media runs with this. So good to hear that was fairly well reported on this. Let's talk about this invasive species now, because this is an aspect that also we spoke on the podcast a lot. And how bad is that impact on the, outside of the lions? I presume we established that lions are not that much affected, but overall, how bad is the situation with how big of a problem are those big-headed ants?
Yeah, I think we're just at the front end of that question, really. What happens next? So there's all these other things that use those trees. There's, other insects. There's, birds that nest in those trees. What's their life like, when ants come into their nest? Or when the tree cover has been changed and those trees aren't safe for nesting anymore. These ants live underground, so there could be changes in the underground community as well, in the soil community. And kind of on
the big-headed ants, correct. The invasive ones.
Yeah, the invasive ants, yeah. And then, abiotic processes, so water retention and carbon storage and those sorts of ecosystem processes might be affected as well. So I think we told one thread of the story of this invasion, and no doubt there's many more. And again, this is just one critter that's pretty small. And, I think in places like Ireland and Canada, this story is happening all around us. We just haven't measured it. We just haven't recorded it. But I think that is a common story on planet Earth right now.
Unfortunately. How come species of ants that can deter elephant cannot deal with other ants?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think hopefully you'll see some video of what these interactions look like, but these invasive ants just come in and they're just not, I don't know, that's an evolutionary question. I think there's a lot more of these little ants. Maybe it's a story of what a crowd can do versus a large individual. So a crowd of these big-headed ants can definitely take on the native Chromatogaster mutualist ants, and likewise those native ants can take on, and a swarm can take on, a single elephant. So it might be a question about power and numbers.
Yeah, it might be. It's also this ecological naivety.
Yes. Yeah.
Of the ants. They don't recognize the big-headed ants as an enemy. Is there more research going on, right, to tie the threads to what you already done?
I believe so. Yeah.
Wow, that's great. That's a great to hear. I'm very curious what's going to happen next. Listen, what is there possible? So the broader question, I suppose, on the invasive species, and in this example, so we can start from this example and carry that to more generally, like, do you think that we should intervene and try to, remove those invasive species? Do you, if it's possible, so in other words, should humans continue to get involved? Because obviously they were involved in the very beginning of bringing those ants. Or is it matter of like, well, the ecosystem, if it's, like you said, if it's diverse ecosystem, it has all the trophic cascades and so on, it will rebalance itself now with the new species of ants. So I'm curious. I understand that the question is very broad. So take it as you want. You can start narrowly with this particular example and take it broader, whichever way you want it.
Yeah. So I mentioned that our kind of affiliation at the university is in restoration, which means a lot of different things to different people. There's a different paper on what is restoration or rewilding. Like every week, someone's writing that paper or a version of that paper, and I think that it kind of speaks to this question. Like, so to me, it's what do we want the world to look like? That's the question. And so there is some management that has happened for big-headed ants and other places in the world that revolve around poisoning the land and trying to eradicate them. And that's, going to bring up other problems in a place like this. If you poison the land, like other insects that are beneficial are going to die. And then what's the consequences of letting the big-headed ant run the show? And right now, they don't seem to be that severe because of compensation by robust land management and an intact food web. So we're going to get fewer trees. You may see a decline in buffalo over time. We haven't seen it yet. You may see increases in zebra, but we haven't really seen that yet. We may see declining lion density, but we haven't seen it yet. So, is it worth poisoning the world to try to stop this ant, which we probably can't do anyways? Or is it better to think about how can we take care of the things that we do have control over, like making sure our cattle are well managed, or making sure that there's spaces for these large animals to move around the landscape so they can access the resources they need to survive. I think those are the questions that we should focus on, and they have benefits for things well beyond coping with this big-headed ant, because there's all those other stressors on the landscape as well that will benefit from better land management practices.
So I'm taking that your view is managing the land, but not heavy-handed management of the land, more of like enriching it and encouraging the natural processes, natural resilience of the landscape, rather than, like you said, poison or shoot or whatever else.
Yeah, I don't think we can. That's because I don't think we can really do much to stop this ant from moving around now that it's here. I mean, it's kind of late to be asking, not you're asking, but for people to be asking, how do we, deal with this ant? The way to do that is, we don't want this here. Let's stop it from spreading. So, check your boots, check your firewood, check your crops, check your grain supplies and imports. That's the time to do, biocontrol. And we're seeing that issue. It's famous in Australia, but it's everywhere. We're dealing with an invasive freshwater mussel problem here in Western Canada. We've just discovered chronic wasting disease in our province, and that's going to be a big problem. This issue of how do we manage the flow of bad biological material across lands and across borders is just part of moving forward and on planet Earth as a species.
How do you reconcile the movement of those factors, species, by humans and versus, because these things are happening. I guess we're getting into a bit wider discussion about like what's invasive, what's non-invasive, right? Animals can reach continents on the driftwood, or even like indigenous or hunter-gatherer people, they were also moving animals around. And then, like, what's your take on this? Is it moment in time? Is it everything? It depends on the whether there is an ecological niche, because that's one of it, right? Like, okay, it might be invasive, but we have an ecological niche for this, therefore it's okay. So I'm curious, like, what's your take on this, or maybe like what is in general current state of play?
My thoughts are, what's the damage? So I don't like the idea that there's a certain state that ecosystems need to be in for them to be intact or perfect or whatever. I just don't like that type of accounting. And I think restoration is quite guilty of, thinking about certain landscapes as requiring some species to be there for it to be, intact, and others aren't allowed to be there. And I don't think that is a very useful paradigm to navigate this world right now. I did some reading on views of invasive species by an Indigenous community in Ontario, Canada, Anishinaabe, and the perspective that was shared in this paper, which I'd be happy to share with you. I don't want to speak for this community, but the idea was, all species have some value to people and to other links in nature. We just haven't discovered them yet. That's what a weed is. And I found that kind of view of it to be settling. It was kind of a nice way to think about, I don't like dandelions on my yard because I've been conditioned to think that way, but they're actually not a huge problem if I look at it objectively. So, I think there's ways of, just kind of coexisting with things like big-headed ants. But yeah, there's other species that are moving around naturally. In our part of the world, white-tailed deer are moving through the boreal forest in a way that, they weren't really there decades ago in the same way. And it's probably something to do with climate change. This is work being led by my PhD student, Melanie Dickey. And if white-tailed deer move into areas where caribou are, there's a chance that food web or the stability of the caribou populations will be threatened by predation from wolves and this other sort of food webby thing. But the idea is, yes, they're kind of a natural invader, if you will, and that alone is not a problem, but it's the impacts they have on endangered species and cultural practices associated with those species that are put at risk by the presence of white-tailed deer.
This is exactly, like I'm on the fence on this one, because there is one element of that you mentioned that some portion of ecologists goes like, okay, there should be, rainforest, let's say, therefore all the deer needs to be shot. And then there is like, oh, but this deer has cultural value. It's been here for so many 100 years and wherever else. And it's like extremely hard to reconcile what to do, especially that in most cases, you're not dealing with a robust ecosystem. You're dealing with an ecosystem where everything is endangered. Like you have the same feeling that whichever way you look at whatever animal, it's endangered or almost endangered or vulnerable. And then, it's like, oh, maybe the cultural value of this or that is, and who's to decide? Right? Like,
yeah, the way I've tried to settle it in my mind is to look past the species identity and the structures and think about the relationships as being one of the things that we should spend more time focusing on. Not that certain species should or shouldn't be there. I mean, some can be damaging, as I mentioned, but it's really about reestablishing the connection. So, if you think about human-wildlife conflict, that there's these habituated animals that have lost their fear of people and they become a threat to people. And so that idea of human-wildlife conflict is kind of like a misguided foraging opportunity for that carnivore. Why is it eating sheep and not deer? Or why is it not afraid of people like it used to, and it's become, food conditioned or habituated to people, and that becomes a problem. So, I think we need to think about restoring those relationships. We have national parks where there's, in actually a lot of cities that have urban deer problems, and are trying to think about how to manage that. And people are like, well, maybe we need to teach them to be afraid of people again, so that they're not seeing someone's backyard as a refuge. And so it's not like the deer are invasive. It's that we've lost that connection, kind of like the memory of European farmers and wolves. How do we restore that memory and that relationship?
And there's also things like something that I speak quite often. I'm sure there is a parallel in Canada as well, with, for example, farming practices changing habitat in the way that predators, like mesopredators, becomes abundant because they some of the species are doing well, and then they in turn affecting some other species that are endangered. And then you're going into scenario of predator control, and then you go into scenarios like, oh, why are you shooting native animal, right? Well, it's maybe native, but it's not at that density, and it's just like total mess. I would like to, to wrap this up, ask you about some words of wisdom, like how to navigate these difficult conversation and these difficult, because it some people may think it's quite simple. Oh, that's a native species, you shouldn't be shooting it, fix the downward problem. But the downward problem is the freaking branch of economy. You're not going to fix it overnight. So how would you navigate those conversations? How would you have like a educated conversation, but at the same time not being like, it depends, yes and no, which are always correct answers, right? But they're not necessarily bringing us closer to any solutions.
Well, that was going to be my answer. So I don't know what to say. If I can't say it, as an ecologist, if I can't say it depends, I don't really have a leg to stand on. That problem or that issue and complexity is something we deal with on a regular basis here, especially around predator management. There's no simple way. I mean, there's a challenge when, people talk about it being controversial to say remove predators to grow on other species, but it's also controversial to take somebody's job away to protect endangered species. I'm not saying one is more right than the other, but those decisions impact people in real ways. So it's easy in an era of social media to have strong opinions and not really face any consequences for those opinions. And so I think where we can gain traction on solving these problems is to have more connection and trust within human communities to work collaboratively to solve problems. And where we are, especially, to think less, where I see benefits is less top down or large scale policies, and allow space for more local or decentralized decision making. And that's especially true for us in Western Canada, where there's certainly a growing prominence of Indigenous voices in political spaces. And there's a real potential benefit to that in terms of land management decisions that sort of reflect local cultures and values. We had a case a few years ago where there was grizzly bear hunting in British Columbia, and there's communities, and then it was banned, and that benefited some communities. They were calling for that and talking about Indigenous communities, and others were left out of the picture, and those voices weren't heard. And so when I look at a situation like that, it's really about, well, how could we partition this policy so that it reflects the values of the people it affects the most? And try to teach decentralized decision making to a colonial government like we have in Canada is really hard, because we've got a legacy of, we don't give up power, we don't devolve power very easily. But I think that's kind of the future, and we've done some scholarship around wildlife management in that context about, how do we localize and indigenize wildlife management approaches to, bring different knowledge systems together, and sort of pull away from some of the older paradigms that, have led to a lot of the problems that we're looking at today.
That's probably one of the smartest things I ever heard. So thank you for that. This decentralizing policy, this is, I think, exactly on many levels what we need. That was very good. Thank you for that. Listen, to come back to finish it off and come back to the original topic in the paper. How long before we can expect to see some follow-up research, some follow-up papers? And would it be, you expect to be co-authoring them? Should people follow you on the ResearchGate or whatever if they curious? Because I'm curious about the, all the research that you mentioned that is ongoing. And is you expecting to be, another 5 years, another 30 years? What's the future?
Yeah, we definitely we have active research projects in this part of the world right now, and not necessarily related to big-headed ants, but certainly carnivore, antelope, plant interactions are fascinating and fill our curiosity as scientists and people that enjoy the natural world a lot. The whole thing also rests on the viability of funding for the scientists involved and being able to maintain partnerships in a meaningful way. So that's an active conversation amongst the co-authors. How do we keep some of this going? And hopefully we'll get lucky and continue to be able to fund this work.
Folks, links to some of the popular press interpretations, the paper itself, as well as Adam's profile on ResearchGate will be in the show notes as always. Adam, thank you very much. It's been very good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. Enjoyed it.